All right. Welcome everyone to this workshop by Workforce Institute. My name is Derek Bowman, and I'm going to be sharing some information today about visual design strategy for UX and UI and product design. I'll use those terms kind of interchangeably. Let me introduce myself first, and then we can briefly understand who we have here in the room with us, and then we'll get in and I'll share some of my thoughts and experience here. So, like I said, my name is Derek Bowman. I am based in the Salt Lake City, Utah area. I am a product designer, a product design leader. I manage a team, and I work in the fintech space. Here's some of my hobbies here. I'm also an instructor with Workforce Institute. I teach one of the UX UI 24-week program there. Maybe some of you are in that program or considering it. So I'm currently teaching the cohort that started in March. And so we're about 8 weeks in on the cohort that I'm teaching. I work at a company called Avant. We are in the consumer credit and lending space. And again, I'm the director of product design there. And so I lead our UX, product research, and interface design, the practices within Avant. And so I'm just curious just who I'm speaking to here. So maybe if we can just give you can either just raise a hand using the Zoom feature, or I'd love to hear just what is everyone's familiarity with product design, UX or UI. People come from different backgrounds, so maybe you're from a design or creative background, or research, usability, or some unrelated field. So who do we have here today? So maybe Andrew. If you're there, could you just very briefly, what's your background?
Can you hear me or no?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So currently, I work in construction, but I've basically taught myself a number of programs, the whole Adobe suite and everything. I used to do some web design stuff for a car shop I was in, but then switched over to construction just because it was a little bit better, a little bit better pay there, and so.
What brings you here today?
I just want to get up and enjoy my job. So
okay, yeah, fair enough.
That's kind of where we're at.
All right, Oscar, does your background fit one of these, or where are you coming to us from? He's unavailable right now. How about Abhini? I think we've spoken in the past, right?
Yeah, hi. Nice to see you again. So
yeah, likewise.
So I'm Abhini, and coming from a computer engineering background, I worked as a UX designer for almost 3 years, and then I am currently studying human-computer interaction. I'm a student, and this summer I have some goals in mind. One of those is to brush myself with visual design skills, and that's why I'm here. So I have worked into the UX field, starting with the research and interaction design. I think that I need to improve a lot in the visual design area, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah,
nice to meet you.
Well, yeah, welcome. And Monet, if you're there, tell us a little bit about you.
I am Monet, and I just finished my digital marketing certificate with the CSU with the Workforce Institute, and this was just recommended to me. So,
yeah, welcome. We'll have there'll be pieces in here that will be relevant to digital marketing, so hopefully this will be valuable for you as well. And we got Layal joining us, who I think is from my class, my current cohort. Is that the same Layal joining?
Yes, that's me. Hi.
Great, welcome. Well, we're just about to dive in, so Well, good to meet you all, and hopefully I can make this valuable for each of you. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about visual design. And so what that is, just to define it, so we're on the same page here. When I talk about visual design, I'm talking about the presentment layer, or the look and feel, the branding, the interface layer of a website or a mobile app or some kind of digital product. And so what I'm going to be talking about is, what is a visual design strategy, how to put one together, or what types of things to think about, and then why should your company even have one? So we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple different areas. So to start off, let's kind of rewind in history, because what we're going to talk about is like visual design as a unifying set of patterns for a company. This is not necessarily something that is a new or recent phenomenon. That if you think back hundreds of years, ranchers have been branding their cattle to kind of set apart their product from their competitors' product, or just differentiate, their herd from another herd. In like medieval times, there were merchant guilds where a merchant would have their own unique stamp that they would put on their goods that they would produce and sell, and that you would know that this came from this specific merchant. And so this is just a couple of examples from some medieval merchant trademarks that were made. And in the mid 20th century, the graphic design started to catch on to this idea of creating a unified system to unite a company's touch points that they reach out to their customers. And so this is an example from Olivetta typewriters from Italy, and some of the posters that they created. This was made by, it's very famous work from designer Giovanni Pintori, and it was a look and feel, bright colors, even went from the collateral posters to the product itself, had this kind of very fun unifying look. Other famous examples from this period were the work the graphic designer Paul Rand did for IBM, very famous, influential work. And then I'll talk a little bit about Lufthansa Airlines also during this period. And this was a very common phenomenon where a lot of corporations were looking at this very disparate, messy set of visuals that they had across their company, and it was creating a very disjointed experience for their customers. And so Lufthansa hired a graphic designer, or got a graphic designer to create a unified set of standards for their company. And those standards extended from a new typeface font, this kind of very bold sans serif typeface, as well as a streamlined color palette. Wendelin, welcome. If you wouldn't mind going on mute, just so the rest can hear here. And thanks for joining. So so there was like a new unifying typography, a new color palette, this very simple blue and yellow color scheme, which was in print collateral, it was in signage, ticketing, the airplane exterior and interior, packaging for different food items, the employee uniforms. They really created a holistic, unified system, which was pretty new and innovative at the time to have a corporation that united. And that spirit, or that history, kind of carries forward into modern graphic user interfaces, or GUIs, or UI design. Has a very similar philosophy to all of those historical examples that I just gave, of how do you create a consistency within a brand? How do you use your visuals to stand out in the market, and it also to create a competitive advantage? So a couple principles that I'll call out here. There's something called the aesthetic usability effect. This has been studied and researched by like Nielsen Norman Group and other UX people out there. And what they've found is that individuals, when they use a UI design that they find to be aesthetically pleasing or that has strong visual design, that they also perceive that interface to have high usability. So there's a high correlation between the perceived usability of a system and its visual design. So oftentimes the visual design can potentially cover some shortcomings in the UX of the product. It shouldn't be a substitute for it, but that if all things being equal, if there were two systems and one was nicer to look at or nicer to the eye, that it would be perceived as actually a more usable system too, which is really interesting. So when we talk about strategy, some people use this word strategy almost to mean like a plan, like what's your plan for this? What's your strategy? But a strategy is not just a plan. It's not just having a style guide for your visual design. That's not a strategy. A strategy in the business sense tells you where to play and how to win. Like what is our strategy in a competitive landscape? And so a couple things from a visual design standpoint, like, well, how could visual design impact a business strategy, or what inputs might it have to it? So a couple to think about, like a brand from its visuals can create distinctness from competitors, can set them apart. You think about colors that are very strongly associated with certain brands and how that, sets them apart from their competitors, like pink for Lyft and black for Uber in that rideshare market. Operational effectiveness. Could you create design systems and reusable components using your visual design or a set of standards where you don't have to revisit the same decisions over and over again, or you have components that make rapid iteration and speed to market on products much faster? Or finally, how could you improve your customer lifetime value by continually delighting your customers to keep them coming back and building loyalty over time? So a couple of really important inputs that visual design could have into larger company and brand strategies. So I'm going to talk about 3 different pillars that you could think about as you develop or consider how to develop a visual design strategy for your company. And those are personality, clarity, and unity. I'm going to go into each one of these and talk about some of the building blocks of a visual design library or language, like typography, like color, like hierarchy, spacing, and how those fit into these 3 pillars of personality, clarity, and unity. So we'll talk about personality first. And I'm going to run through these and then I'll take questions at the end. So if you think of something along the way, feel free to write it down, and we'll come back to it. We'll have an open dialogue and some questions after I run through some of these, if that's all right. So first off, personality. So we mentioned one person we have from marketing or a digital marketing background. Oftentimes on the product design side, I'm going to be speaking from that angle because that's where I'm from. Oftentimes on the UX product design side, the marketing team has already established some of the foundational pieces of a brand. Like they may have done a logo, they may have a color palette, they may have a corporate font or typeface. And so if you're working on the UX side, you may be able to inherit some of that from the marketing team, or the marketing or brand team. But there's some distinct things that you might need to think about. So here's an example from Robinhood, which is a financial trading app. And on the left is their .com site. So if you went to robinhood.com, that's their marketing page. And on the right is their mobile app once you have an account. And the considerations there are different. We'll come back to this a little bit later, but the visual considerations on one side are all about engaging and moving someone through a funnel and sending articulating the value proposition and getting someone to sign up. And so it's very expressive. On the right side, a lot of times when we're thinking about product design or UX, we're thinking about usability, we're thinking about task-based functionality that is more productive. And so there's a distinction that the visual, having a very unique, productive visual design strategy, distinct and separate from the marketing brand strategy, is important. However, the two must work hand in hand. You may be starting out, however, where you don't have that foundation from a brand or marketing team, and so you're establishing something from scratch. And so knowing your personality that you want to convey through your visual design is an important first step. And so this is an exercise. There's a bunch of others that you could do to just try and wrap your head around what is the personality of this, which will inform other things later on. But knowing what is the message that you want to convey to your audience and knowing who that audience is are really important. So you may be able to leverage past UX research or other personas that may have been developed in order to know what the personality is. But if you don't have that, you could use an exercise like this, which creates some adjectives that are on they're diametrically opposed on continuums. And then you could ask yourself, well, are we friendly or are we formal? Do we want it to be quirky or conventional, modern or classic? And to plot your very unique line through this personality spectrum, and then use that to inform your visual design. So next, an activity that I like that is to start to set a look that you want to go is called style tiles, which are similar to like a persona, if you're familiar with that, in that it's a very simple board that just calls out some things that you want to keep in mind, or that you might want to directionally go with this. Or if you think about mood boards, if you've seen that in marketing or fashion or other types of design have mood boards, but how a style tile differs is that it's starting to use components from a UI design, but they're not put together in individual screens or layouts yet. They're isolated components, and it's simply to start to explore a language. So you might have two or three different samples or things that you're trying out here, like in this example, where you're looking at, how round should this button be? Or what is the color palette? Or let's start to look at like a simple card or a navigation, but it's isolated. It's not in a full mock-up, and therefore you can iterate on it faster and just get a sense of, is this generally a look that makes sense for an interface? Or does this fit our personality better than this one? And start to make some decisions there. So that's a technique that I like. Color is super important and is very important for your personality. You think about like Amazon use orange as their primary brand color, which conveys like this sense of a little bit of like whimsy or excitement, optimism, versus like Chase Bank, another large brand, which uses like a blue brand color, which blue psychologically feels more secure or safe or trustworthy, which fits the personality that they're trying to convey. And be aware that there are these psychological effects, and those can vary country to country, culture to culture. So be aware of that as well. But try to align a color palette that fits with the overall personality that you're trying to create. So in UI design, you want actually quite a lot of colors, and you'll stick to a few, but it's helpful to have some, like, not just a simple color palette, but to have a range of shades and tints available to you within your design language. And you'll want like a full range of neutrals. Most of your UI will actually be neutral colors, which could be shades of gray or some desaturated type of neutral palette. Like this upper one in neutrals you may use for thin lines. This very dark one you may use in dark mode as the background color. the primary would be like, what is your primary brand color? Like I mentioned, orange for Amazon, red for Target, so on. But you also want system status colors built into your visual design language as well, because within a product, you might need to alert the user of different system things, tasks that are running. A success when something successfully completes, a warning, maybe an error state, and as well as a more neutral info state. So unlike brand or marketing, you may need, because UI design is more communicative, you may need a larger color palette that you're working with. Once you have that, you then should think about what are the ratios within my UI of each color palette. And there's a really simple formula that's very good for beginners, but also works really well just for advanced designs as well. It's called the 60-30-10 color palette, which is like 60% is some kind of primary color, 30% is of the UI is a secondary color, and then only 10% is that primary brand color, and it's only used for like accents or to guide the user to the like most actionable pieces. And if you follow this formula, it's very simple, but generally you'll have pretty good UI results. So I'll maybe pause there because I've been talking a lot about personality or anything we've talked about so far. Does anyone have any questions on any of that? Okay, I'll continue then. So talking about clarity, which is the second pillar here. This is all about how do you make things clear? How do you make the controls, the functionality within an experience so that the user knows what they can do, where to go next, and that the information really comes forward and the everything else recedes to the background until it's called upon, that the content is king. So we'll talk about typography because that's really the workhorse of communication within an app. So going back to this, sometimes within more of a marketing or a landing page or a campaign context, the typography is very expressive. It's very, it's telling some kind of brand story, where in an app or in like a dashboard or something, it may be more productive. It may be more utilitarian and more task focused rightly. And so your visual design strategy should account for, or may need to account for, more expressive modes of typography and more productive modes. And they're in IBM's design system. It's called the Carbon design system, which you could go look up. They make this distinction of expressive versus productive typography. It's really interesting, the guidelines that they give to their designers that are designing for those separate contexts. An important piece of typography is developing a scale of like, what sizes are we going to use? Don't just design every screen to work within itself. You have to think of the system in a much larger form. And so having a unified scale of, from like your biggest headings would be considered like an H1 in HTML, to like captions, buttons, paragraph copy, and having set standards that your team can follow, that every time we have an H4, it's this specification. And this example is from Material Design by Google and the typography scale that they use. And you can develop one of these using a tool called like typescale.com. And it's really interesting because you can do it based on a musical scale, which I read this in a book called the Elements of Typographic Style a number of years ago. And it recommended using musical scales to create a typography sizing scale from large to small, and it would add harmony, visual harmony, just like a musical scale would. And I thought that was a really funny recommendation until I tried it and saw the wisdom of it. And you can play around with that. This example here is using the major third scale, like from music, to add a harmonious sizing to typography is really interesting. So you can play around with something there. So obviously type adds hierarchy and guides the user to what's most important, secondary, tertiary, and so on. But type's only one way you can do that. You can also create visual hierarchy, and that should be part of your strategy as well to create clarity. So spacing could have a similar scale, just like with typography, from very small spacing variables that you've defined to larger ones. So like here, there's a half X, there's an X, there could be a 2X. And so everything is like incremental, but they all have a unified base dimension. An 8-point scale is a really common one in UI design. So all of like the spacing between elements or around elements are increments of 8, like 8, 16, 24, 32, 48, so on. And having everything have that 8-pixel base creates unity throughout the visuals. Even if someone doesn't realize it, it just feels more unified to their eye. This example here is from a guy that I follow that I really like, Mikhail Malowitz. I really like, he's got courses, he's got information, he does awesome stuff. Yeah, I just saw a heart there. I don't know if that's a heart for him, but he does awesome stuff. And so this is an example. He calls these hierarchy strips. It's a way that he notates his UI to call out, like, what is the primary thing I want someone to see, and then the secondary, and then the tertiary. And images are really great for creating that hook to draw people in, with the primary, the highest part of the hierarchy, which creates the emotional connection. So using imagery, especially if it's of like people's faces or photos looking directly out at the viewer, are going to be particularly engaging. And then secondly, large typography, iconography, things like that will then draw people in as well, and add the second piece, which would be like the description. So you hook people with an emotional connection, you describe or you provide some kind of description, and finally you call them to action. And so there's this navigational button at the bottom that is now confirm this thing or take some kind of action. And so that kind of first, second, third visual hierarchy, it sounds simple, but it can take some practice and a refined eye to get just the right way. Here it's reading top to bottom, but hierarchy doesn't have to read that way. You can use sizing, white space, color to draw attentions, even if it's not the topmost thing. Even if it's not top to bottom, you can still influence where your user's eye is moving through a composition. So lastly, unity. Unity is all about consistency, cohesion throughout an experience. Consistency creates cohesion, where inconsistency creates dissonance or confusion, or can be frustrating even for users. So in a larger company, or in a company with multiple designers or multiple teams working, this consistency can be tricky. Different designers, if it's not kept in check, could start to go in different directions or explore things where it could create a very disjointed experience for the user. Where this is the company that I work for at Avant, and this is an example across 3 of our different product areas, and how we've sought to create a unified language across all of our different product areas. And we are very deliberate in how we do that, that we meet multiple times a week to see what each other are working on, even though we're working on different projects and on different teams, to make sure that we're keeping a consistent experience for our users, so that as they move from one product area to another, that it feels very familiar and they don't have to relearn how certain patterns work, or what certain colors mean, if there's a certain meaning that's ascribed to a color or an icon, that's consistent throughout as they move through. And we named our design system Tapestry, not only because we have these repeating patterns as a key part of our brand, but also this idea of like interweaving our experiences together to be a consistent, unified whole. one trap that this is a bonus tip, but one trap to avoid is don't get caught up in too trendy of a UI design. Sometimes you'll see these posts that are like 2023's most trendy designs or design UI trends to follow. And sometimes those can be a trap. A couple of years ago, there was a trend called neomorphism, which was really big on dribble.com, and a bunch of designers were doing it. However, I didn't really see like products adopting it. It's a very complicated set of like shadows and highlights, and it's this one on the left. Although I did see Verobank adopted this. That was the only product that I saw that actually adopted this trend that was happening on Dribble. And it's one of those things that was a moment in time. It looked really good for the moment when it was new and fresh, but it didn't age very well. In fact, you don't see it very much anymore. And this was only a couple of years ago. It very quickly looked dated and even confusing. And so within a couple of years, Vero redesigned they had to redesign their entire app, which from a business strategy perspective is a very poor way. That was a very poor strategy, in my opinion, because that can be costly to redesign your app, and to go with something that was so trendy and of a moment in time that it wasn't tested and it didn't prove to be very long lasting. Like the one on the right is using patterns that are a little more simple, but also a little more like timeless in a lot of ways. And I would say is a much better approach for it. And so don't fall into that trap, especially early on. A lot of students or inexperienced designers will latch on to trends without thinking of broader context. But I would say stick with things, be a student of history, and look at what's worked over time and what continues to feel modern and fresh, even if it's following like principles that have been developed, decades ago. And lastly, UX design, of course, we always test everything that we make. And so a lot of times testing, though, is like, is it usable? Is it functional? So how might you test the visual design? And just see if your visual design is working the way that you intend it to. Well, here's some things that you may consider. So on the left are questions you may ask yourself, and on the right are questions that you could ask a user in testing to determine that, to answer that question for you. So you might want to know, are the icons that we've chosen, are they recognizable? Do people understand what that icon means? And so you might ask, what do you think that symbol means? Without leading it too much, figure out, is that communicating the right way? Is the visual hierarchy guiding people to the right places? So you might ask, what's the first thing you notice on this page? And see if your eyes are going where you expected them to go with your visual hierarchy. Or you might be wondering, are you conveying the right emotional identity? And so you could ask something like, what words would you use to describe the personality or tone of this application? And depending on how they answer that, you could know, did I hit the mark? Or is what I'm communicating different than what I intended to communicate? And so testing can be valuable for the usability of your app, but you can also test the visuals, the presentation, the look and feel as well. And so those are the three pillars in this framework that make up this visual design strategy. And by creating a unique personality, by making sure that the communication is clear and that it's consistent across the product and different domains that were within your company, then hopefully that can ladder up to larger business goals and objectives, and design can play a really important part in the way that your users or customers experience your brand. So that's all I have here, but if you'd like to follow along, I often will talk about things like this, and so I recommend you follow me on LinkedIn. I'll post there and pretty active there. Feel free to reach out as well. I'll talk about design or leadership or careers, and so you can always find me there. And lastly, I always like to remind people, no matter what your career is, this is a sticker I have sitting on my desk that is just a reminder to make something that you love. find something that resonates with your soul and do that for a career. It's the most fulfilling thing you can do. So with that, I'll say thanks, and I'll open it up to any questions that anyone has.
So I have a question. Maybe this is related to the personality point that you were explaining. Do you
Mhm.
have any example where a company might have failed due to the brand color or personality? I think you explained about that in the consistency or unity section, but I'm just curious to know if a company failed just because of the color or branding.
Failed because of the color of the branding. Yeah, it's a
Mhm.
good question. In I'll tell you the first thing that comes to my mind, which is a more limited. It won't be like, did the company fail? But I can tell you how certain brand colors are trickier than others to design for UI specifically. And that
Mhm.
would be the color red in particular. A lot of times designers will think, I've got to use the brand's primary color for my primary buttons or my primary user interface things. And particularly if the brand's color is red, that can be really tricky to design your primary buttons for. And because if you have an error that occurs, you
Yeah.
usually want to signify an error with a red color, and it can just kind of wash out or in everything else. Or conversely, if everything is normal, but there's a lot of red, it can scream
Yeah.
like something is wrong. And so what you'll see is there are a lot of brands that have like they're red for their brand color, but they'll use a different color in their UI design for like their primary buttons. They might use like a teal or some other color that complements really well their primary red, and they may use their red for branded elements, but for accents within their UI, they'll choose a different color. And so that's maybe one that I could think of where sometimes people think just because their brand color needs to be used a lot or needs to be the primary thing within an app. And sometimes that again, there's that distinction between the brand expressiveness and being true to the brand, but also making sure that colors meet accessibility guidelines, which the brand color may not have considered that when they chose it. And so sometimes the UI designer has to come up with something a little bit different so that it doesn't
Mhm.
fail, as you say, once it moves into like an app or like a more productive type product.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
That's just the first example that came to my head, but yellow could be another one that's really tricky to work with because it often doesn't have enough contrast. So sometimes with like if yellow is the brand color, either choosing a complement to that, or you may have to use like a really dark font on top of your brand color because the just contrast can be really difficult with yellow.
Yeah, makes sense.
Cool. Other questions? And it doesn't have to be about this either. I'm happy to answer any questions about just design in general, careers, students, anything like that. Happy to answer also. Cool. Well, Ramiz, it looks like we don't have any other questions. Anything you'd like to cover? All right. Well, we may end early then. Again, feel free to reach out to me. I want to be a resource for students or those just starting out in this profession. As a design manager and as an instructor, I'm very passionate about helping people enter this field and develop their careers in this field. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or reach out. Happy to help you in your journey in any way that I can. So Appreciate you joining today.
Thank you so much.
All right. See you later.
Thank you.